Sorry about that. I'm on a new computer, so of course there's going to be a little bit of a hiccup. Um,
But you're not upside down.
I'm not upside down. Let's see, not let me. Nicole, I might have to send you my slides, um, which is fine. We can start chatting while I do that. Sorry, everyone. Appreciate your patience.
You are what the most non-judgmental group you could be around.
Right?
Thank you. Thank you for that. I am at I practice one day a week clinically, and I am at the private practice, and I don't often use this computer for the trainings and presentations I do, so it's being a little finicky, but oh, sent it to myself. Don't want to do that. Okay, Nicole, I just emailed you a link to the Canva slides, so you should get those in a second. And while those are coming up, I'll just tell you a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, tell you a little bit about myself. So I am Dr. Anjali Ferguson. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I am based in Richmond, Virginia, but I often provide services across the state and nationally related to culturally responsive practices. And that's what I'm going to speak to you about today. How do we become more responsive in our practices and why that's important for the work that we do? So I want to talk a little bit about what culture is, what cultural identity is, and then hopefully leave you with some tools that you can implement in the work that you do as well. I also want to share with you some results from a recent needs assessment that a colleague and I performed across Virginia on the impacts of things like discrimination related to culture, race, and identity, gender identity, and how that's impacting youth mental health across the state. So, as I mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist. I also try and be pretty cognizant of the fact that that is not my only identity. I am a second generation South Asian immigrant. I am a mother. I'm a partner in a multiracial, multi-faith partnership. And I'm the mother of a Blindian child, Blindian standing for Black and Indian. And all of those things really inform the work that I do and why my career trajectory has really focused on culture and how we can best serve culture. So let's see. Let's go ahead to the next slide if you don't mind, Nicole. Perfect. So as we get started, I want to talk about this term culture and cultural identity. What do I mean when I'm speaking to that so that we can start from the same foundation? Cultural identity is really important because it's a really critical piece of how somebody views their world, somebody views themselves, and it's informed by several different things in our lives that we absorb and then we interpret for ourselves to build our values and our beliefs and then our behaviors as a result. And every single one of us has culture. Oftentimes when we think of culture, we think of minoritized communities, racially minoritized communities, but culture is present in all of us. And culture can be very personal and internal, but there are also external factors that influence our culture and our cultural identity development, organizational things that influence us culturally, and things that happen historically and socio-culturally as well. For example, we have all lived through a global pandemic. That was a cultural event that has impacted us in different ways, which has then impacted how we behave, how we respond to those types of incidents, and ultimately impact us as people too. And these identity processes start pretty early in development, which we're going to explore here in a second. Next slide, please. Our culture can often change across our development, but can start really early in childhood. And it's important for us to remember that culture and cultural identity can be very fluid too, meaning it can change from one point to the next and can be influenced by the people around us, the environments, and again, what's happening socioculturally in our lives too. And a child's culture, an individual's culture, can be really different from other people in their own household or of past generations too. So it's important for us to remember these things so that we become flexible in the face of differences when it comes to culture and cultural identity development. Next slide. So let's talk about when we usually see these things start to develop from a race and gender standpoint. So children as young as 6 months of age can recognize race-based differences. And by the time a child is 2 to 4 years old, a child can already internalize racial biases. By the time a child is 10 to 12 years of age, they become pretty set in their racial biases, and it becomes harder to shift after 10 to 12 years. When it comes to gender identity development is fluid, but does start pretty early in childhood, where children 2 years of age start to notice physical differences in their bodies, anatomical differences. By 3 years of age, children start to label themselves as a boy or a girl. And by the time a child is 4, they have a pretty general sense of what their gender identity development is. So again, when I have these conversations about race and culture, I often tell families and tell folks that we have to start these conversations early. And this developmental science is part of why I start to emphasize that. Because these processes start much earlier than us adults are ready to have conversations about these things with children in our lives. And children are internalizing, again, these experiences and the messaging that they're receiving from their families or media or socially with peers. And then as a product, developing their cultural identity and also building biases about other folks as a result. Next slide. So I know there's a lot of hesitancy when it comes to talking about things related to culture, particularly race and gender identity development. It's become a highly politicized topic. But much like teaching children about ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, we have to be cognizant as adults and caregivers in child's lives to also teach them about culture, cultural development, and how to respond to differences in culture and cultural identity development. Next slide. From a mental health standpoint, why is this important? So we know that there are disparities across race and gender and cultural experiences where those from minoritized backgrounds or socially marginalized backgrounds often experience rates of mental illness at higher rates than their peers. We've also seen that as a product of the pandemic, these mental health disparities have significantly increased. So if you're familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, with the ACEs study, which identified adverse childhood experiences as relating to significant mental health outcomes and physical health outcomes, what we started seeing after the pandemic was that experiences with adverse childhood experiences started to significantly increase in children, with 13% of children reporting 4 or more ACEs during COVID. Now that's a concerning number because the original ACEs study identified that 4 or more ACEs could result in later adult outcomes like heart disease, cancer, diabetes in adulthood. And we were seeing these profound increases in these experiences of child maltreatment or early childhood adversities as a product of COVID. Individuals who experience these early childhood adversities are at greater risk for things like depression and anxiety, trauma-related symptoms, problems forming relationships, difficulties academically, interpersonally, all of which relate to those mental health kinds of symptoms and outcomes. And what we were also seeing during the pandemic is that youth were reporting feeling greater symptoms of sadness and hopelessness, with more than 22% considering suicide and 10% attempting suicide. And as I mentioned, when it comes to many things that we see in our healthcare systems, there are disparities across minoritized groups, with LGBTQ plus youth often being at greatest risk and racially minoritized also being at greatest risk. And what we were seeing is that those feelings of depression and suicidality were greatest for LGBTQ plus youth, with nearly half seriously considering suicide, and Black students also being at much higher rates of attempting suicide relative to other racial groups. So I always talk about this mental health epidemic that we are now facing, that we are just starting, really. And it's a byproduct of the impacts of COVID. COVID has just widened the gaps that were already pre-existing prior to the pandemic. And so these concerns started to raise questions for us here in the field, wondering what other factors might also exacerbate these disparities that we're seeing in these culturally minoritized groups. So we conducted a needs study a couple months ago, earlier this year, where parents and educators attended focus groups to report on mental health symptoms that they're seeing in the youth in their lives here in Virginia. And the groups were comprehensively, they included all regions across the state. So we had groups that were focused in Northern Virginia, the Eastern Shore, Southwestern, and Central Virginia. And they were representative of, again, parents and educators across all of those regions. Next slide. And what we found were that parents and educators in Virginia were seeing that 50% of the youth they interacted with were reporting depressive symptoms, 59% were reporting anxiety-related symptoms, 46% were reporting symptoms consistent with ADHD, and 62% were experiencing behavioral problems and concerns. Next slide. What we also saw was that gender and racial discrimination were of top of mind for these parents and educators, with 51% of parents and educators reporting that the LGBTQ youth in their lives experienced a significant amount of gender discrimination in schools, and 59% report a significant concern related to youth experiences of racial discrimination in schools. Next slide. 50% of the participants reporting having children who identified as being LGBTQ, and 74% of the participants reported having children who identified as racially minoritized. And like I said, 59% reported discrimination as being a concern that they were seeing the youth face in their lives. Next. We also wanted to assess their perceptions of what was maybe causing some of this distress, or what was causing these observed patterns of discrimination. And 54% of parents and educators felt pretty concerned about the current policies and legislation that youth were facing, feeling that they were contributing to these mental health outcomes and contributing to the discrimination that youth were facing. And they felt that 68% felt that these policies were having a profound impact on youth mental health. Next slide. So we also asked them to report on the experiences of the marginalized youth in their lives. And we wanted to see what themes were developed as a result of their observations. And they described their youth experiences as being traumatic and stressful, socially isolating or exclusive, and lacking support. Next slide. They were also asked about those concerns again that they felt these youth were facing, which they thought might be contributing to mental health outcomes. And they felt that the concerns were related to discrimination, peer relationships like bullying, peer conflict, and peer pressure, substance use related concerns, violence, both in the community and school safety concerns, and then again, exposure to mental health and mental health needs and lack of support for mental health in schools. So greater rates of depression, anxiety, and trauma. Next slide. So what do we do with this information? I mean, this is a lot of information. This is maybe not surprising information, but it is still important and profound to see these impacts within our own state. I know we talk about things often from like a national statistic level, but seeing again these stats come out within Virginia and hearing it straight from parents and educators highlighted, I think, for us the concern and how prominent these issues are for the youth today. And there's several things that we can do as practitioners who work with children and families. And it really does come down to us starting to become more responsive to cultural needs and making sure we are actively incorporating those needs into our discussions and into our care. Next slide. So you've heard me talk about cultural responsiveness a lot. And what does that mean? You might have heard the term cultural competence. Cultural competence is a term that we have used for many, many years to try and define how people should approach culture. We suggest that you have to become competent in culture, but now there's a shift away from this term because competence suggests an end point. It suggests that there is an ending to this process, that there's a goal that can be met. And the reality is that no one can really be competent in culture. We can't be competent in our own culture, let alone someone else's culture. So the move in mental health now is to be more cognizant of being responsive to culture when you face culture, and then being humble to learning and adapting and flexible in the face of cultural differences. Next slide. So we want to teach cultural humility, which is again, that flexibility and openness to learning. And we want to teach cultural responsiveness to practitioners when they are working with children and families. And when we're speaking to cultural humility, there's a few things we want folks to do, but it starts with building self-awareness. So we want providers to start to understand our own biases and privileges. And this is the hardest part of the work because many times we don't feel good when we're confronted with our biases or our privileges. Our guards go up, our walls go up. It makes us uncomfortable to kind of recognize that maybe we do have bias when it comes to certain communities or groups. But the reality is all of us have biases and privileges of some form or another. And it's important we start to become aware of what those are because they help us better address them and be less blind to them when they're in the room. The next thing we want to teach for cultural humility is an openness to learning. So this requires us to stay open and curious about differences in families or youth or people that we encounter, and also be okay with not having all the answers when it comes to culture. That is perfectly fine. That's actually expected of this process. Nobody expects you to know everything. What we do expect is the commitment to growth. Right? We want you to stay humble and understand that this process is a lifelong learning process so that you can maintain that learning throughout your career trajectory and throughout your work. When it comes to cultural responsiveness, how you start to apply that really starts with flexibility in our care. So when we are trained, this is a bit counter to how we become trained because oftentimes we get trained in models or we're trained in a certain system or a certain approach or protocol. And the reality is that one size does not fit all. So we want to teach folks to be more flexible in how they are working with each individual or each family. And again, going back to assessing those blind spots for ourselves so that we stay aware of things that make us uncomfortable and how that might impact our interactions in this flexibility. We also want to actively incorporate culture. So that's going to require us to actively speak about it and actively include it in our discussions with families. We need to understand how somebody's culture could impact an individual and their presentation when it comes to mental health outcomes, because it does. And then we want to make space for race. We're going to talk a bit more about what that means here in a second. because we need to acknowledge that things outside of the home are often impacting how an individual is presenting from a mental health capacity. Next slide. So of course, there's often barriers to how we adapt to these principles and how we apply these things. But many times, some of the biggest barriers are just a lack of preparation or a lack of practice, a lack of opportunity for these discussions. And two is fear and discomfort. I always talk, when I talk to folks about race or culture or gender identity, the adults are always like, well, the kids are too young to talk about this, or do we need to have these discussions, or I don't know if that's necessary. And when you peel back the layers for how or why these adults are having these questions, oftentimes it's because they are uncomfortable to approach the discussion, not because the kids aren't ready. Kids want to have these conversations. They want to talk with us about these things. And again, those conversations start really, really early. I have a 3-year-old at home. He wants to talk about race and culture all the time. And it happens in just a very matter-of-fact way. I was just telling a colleague just the other day, he read a book about the Children's March in Birmingham the other night. And he asked me just the other night, he's like, Mommy, do you remember that book we read about how Black children and white children couldn't play on the same playground? Let's talk about it. So I said, okay, let's talk about it. And he said, yeah, remember that happened? And then some kids, they talked to the police and they went to jail. And I said, yeah, how did that make you feel? And he said he felt sad about it. And then he said, let's go play with trucks. I said, all right, let's go play with trucks. But for him, it was just something that he was processing. It was matter of fact. If I had a strong reaction to him asking that question, that's where his judgment about what has happened historically would come in, right? If we can keep it matter of fact, keep our discomfort to a minimum, then kids don't internalize that discomfort too. So it's us and our fear that can sometimes act as a barrier. The next thing is color blindness, which happens much more often than I think we recognize. And the intentionality of color blindness oftentimes comes from a good place, but there isn't this recognition that it actually causes harm in some ways. So color blindness is this approach that folks might say, well, I don't see color or I don't see race. I just see the human being and I just see the person. And everybody is, I see everybody at the same starting point and I just, I don't see race. And while the intention is trying to say, I want to just see you as a person and treat you as a person, the reality is by ignoring culture and race, we are saying we don't see that person completely. Because for the other individual, their culture and their race might matter quite a bit. And historically, culture and race has impacted groups differently. So for us to say we don't see that part of you is us telling that person that we don't see them completely, and it actually invalidates them in a lot of ways. So we want to avoid color blindness. We want to recognize that when culture exists, race exists, it's there, it's in the room. And I understand we're going to have different experiences, but I want to kind of figure out how we can work together or how I can help you or how I can support you. That is a much better approach than I don't see race and I just see you, the person. Next slide. So I mentioned understanding our implicit biases are one of the biggest areas that we want to start with. And just so that we're on the same page, when I'm speaking to implicit biases, I'm talking about unconscious attitudes that manifest in ourselves, again, as a product of our environments or how we were raised. And then these attitudes and stereotypes start to influence actions and decisions that we make. And they happen in a very subconscious and unconscious way. So we don't even know that we are operating from these biases many times. That's what makes them really difficult to change and become aware of. What makes it even tougher is that most times people have different explicit attitudes. So explicitly, I can say, I'm not racist, I'm not discriminatory, but implicitly, I could still have attitudes that are counter to that explicit saying. And because our explicit and implicit biases can be different, it makes it tough again to alter and change and point out for somebody. But again, all of us have biases. the faster and sooner we can recognize that, the better work that we can do when we face people who are from different backgrounds from ourselves. So just things to like think about and reflect on when we're thinking about biases, thinking of who our closest social networks are, because that tends to influence us quite a bit. Or are there things or activities we avoid doing or parts of town we avoid going because we are concerned about what being in that area might be, or concerned about sending our kids to school in that area? Or how do we describe the people in our lives? What are the adjectives we use to describe them? All of those things could possibly inform some of where our biases are coming from. Next slide. The next thing that I have mentioned that I think is critical is, again, making space for race. So what does that mean? Very simply put, it is just opening a conversation to culture and race and making sure that that is on the table when we're working with folks. Because again, children, people want language to understand the world around them. And by naming race, by naming culture, we are providing a platform for families to discuss with us things that are really important to them. And like I mentioned, oftentimes minoritized folks are experiencing things in the world that are impacting their mental health, that's impacting outcomes that sometimes they're not bringing up readily because somebody hasn't made the space for them to discuss that. So for example, we know statistically and through a lot of data that Black children and teens experience on average 5 or more experiences of microaggression or racial discrimination daily. And over time, those racial stressors can have a compounding impact that start to look like trauma symptoms. So that's what racial trauma is. It's having trauma-related symptoms in the face of racial discrimination or microaggression. And those trauma symptoms could be things like anxiety, could be depression, could be sleep disturbances or academic difficulties, all related to experiences of discrimination. So when somebody's having this many in a given day, it's naturally going to have some type of impact on that individual's worldview, and then ultimately going to impact their mental health as well. So we have to be cognizant of creating space for those discussions. Next slide. So how can we support cultural identity development for families? Depending on kind of the level of which we work with families, there are ways that we can encourage they incorporate rituals and routines related to their culture and share those with us. We want to encourage families and parents to share about their own historical memories and childhood experiences with us and their children. We want to expose children as much as we can to cultural content that's relevant to them. We also want to normalize how families support their children through survival messaging, which oftentimes minoritized families have to have discussions with their kids that prepare them to face inevitable discrimination in the world. And those are survival messages, or often called the talk that families have. There's ways that we as providers can support families through this process. We also want to engage in local communities to consider alternative treatment methods. Like I mentioned, many of our mental health fields think in a very individualistic capacity, and we want folks to understand that healing doesn't happen in just one way or one set way. There are multiple avenues towards healing, and we want to encourage families to be able to seek alternatives to that individualistic perspective, because many communities operate more collectively. And then we want to expose children to diverse communities. So I mentioned those statistics on race early in the presentation. The way in which we combat racial biases is racial socialization. It's exposure to people who are different from us. That actually helps instill cultural identity and pride. It makes us more firm in who we are when we see differences. So we want to support families by helping them expose children to diversity, and we can do the same as well. Next slide. When it comes to supporting gender diverse youth, we know that from a statistical standpoint, 60% of LGBTQ youth report that they don't have supportive caregivers in their lives. And what that ends up resulting in is greater rates of depression, anxiety, trauma, and suicidal ideation. And we know through research that just one caring adult in an LGBTQ youth's life can significantly impact outcomes when it comes to the development of these mental health presentations. So what we can do to help support families, next slide, is teach families to expose children from a young age to gender diversity in their content, normalizing it, because again, gender exploration is a typical part of child development. So we want to avoid shaming kids when they are exploring gender in those early years, and just allow them that exploration time and support them again in a matter-of-fact way. And we want to correct harmful individuals in a child's life, because again, that previous slide of the lack of support that LGBTQ youth face, one way that we can be supportive is to be corrective of others who are harmful. We then want to provide families with resources to gender diverse communities, and we ourselves want to try and practice using gender affirming language and incorporate that into our practices. Next slide. So oftentimes when I'm talking about this work, folks still feel uncomfortable with this idea of incorporating culture and don't know where to start, because it can feel, again, daunting and scary and anxiety provoking. So a colleague and I actually created a cultural values assessment that can be used with the individuals that you work with, whether it's children or families or adults, where you have that individual complete this values assessment. So if you're familiar with traditional CBT values assessments, it operates from those same principles, where you would just have a family rank of what's important to them on this sheet. So they would pick 10 of those things and rank them in order. And then next slide. And then you would have them narrow it down to their top 5, ranking again in order of importance. And then you would have them explain to you what each of those values meant for them. So for example, if somebody really values food, what does that mean to them? Because their perception or their rationale for why they value food might be different from why I value food, or what I see in food for my family and my household, excuse me. And the same is true of many of these other cultural factors. So we want to hear from the individual what about this cultural experience is important to them, why it's important to them, and how they then want to incorporate that into the discussions that we would have with them. So this is a nice tool to kind of start those conversations instead of feeling like you're having to pull this out of thin air. So it's something that can be built into intake forms. It's something that can be done in the first or second meeting with a family, but it also can help you build rapport because it helps you build a relationship on a deeper level of getting to know this individual for more than just the mental health concern that's presenting, but these other contextual factors that could also be influencing. Next. So ultimately, from a mental health standpoint too, what we want to ensure is that as we're building up cultural identity, we're thinking from a resilience mindset and really instilling pride. And pride becomes really important for socially marginalized folks because it's essentially a celebration of their identities. And we want people to really feel like their identities matter and that they are held in high regard. Because folks from marginalized backgrounds often experience discrimination or stigma or bias for just existing in their identity. And pride really flips the script on that by telling folks that these things are actually important and they're important enough for me to spend time helping build up for you and important enough for me to support in this space of me working with you too. Next slide. So one of the last things I want to leave you with is just reminders that this is difficult. These conversations are difficult, and the first few times that we're having these discussions, it's gonna feel awkward, and you might stumble, you might make some mistakes, you might unintentionally cause harm at times, but the reality is that nobody expects you to get it right all the time. I mean, I am quote unquote an expert in this, and I still make mistakes all the time. What's important is that you give yourself grace and you keep trying and you keep acknowledging that this is of importance to the people that we work with and the people that we serve. Because what folks ultimately want is they just want to be seen, they want to feel supported and understood, and they want to just know that you will keep trying to see them and hear them for who they are fully. So even if it feels uncomfortable, much like anything else, we have to practice to get better at this too. So give yourselves grace. Next slide. So I will mention that, so I didn't mention this in my intro, but a few years ago, I created an organization called Parenting Culture, and we offer free resources for parents and practitioners on having difficult conversations related to race, gender. We created a kit on how to talk to kids about abortion after the Roe decision was overturned. We've got how do you include gender affirming practices into your care. We've got all sorts of stuff on there. And we are staffed by psychologists of color who are all parents ourselves. So, and we all have expertise in mental health across lifespan. So we create these resources for folks, and they're all available on our website, including that cultural values assessment for free. If you find that interesting, we encourage you head there. We also have a podcast series that explains some of these concepts in much more detail. But I will stop talking and give you a second to ask any questions that you have. But I appreciate your time this afternoon.
I don't have a question. I just want to thank you for coming and sharing with us your knowledge and expertise and keeping the conversation going. So thank you.
Absolutely. Happy to do it.
And I like that you gave me also a new word for instead of cultural competency, because I know that we can never be competent in that. And I love how you were able to help me understand about that responsiveness and flexibility.
Awesome. Any questions or thoughts?
I was just going to say I appreciated this a lot. I have two daughters that identify as brown girls. And, you know, obviously not being brown, there's a lot of things that I feel like I've missed over the years before my daughters came into our lives. And, you know, seeing things with a different lens has really opened my eyes and realized that, oh, wait, we got some work to do. And I appreciate, you know, I guess how to approach those things. And, you know, they're now 16 and they have some very, very frank conversations with my husband and I. Sometimes I feel like they kind of poke just to try to see if they could get a reaction out of us, which is fine. But I do appreciate, you know, the tips and things like that of opening those dialogues and keeping that conversation going.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's thank you for sharing that. And that's great to hear that they do challenge you. I feel like I learned so much from my little one, and he's only 3, so I can't wait till he's a teenager because I'm sure that'll be a trip. But it is eye-opening to just see the difference in perspective with their lived experience and then even what we experience too. And yeah, like I mentioned, the resources that I've spoken to, we've got them much more detailed on the website. And then I'll also mention that last year, my husband and I released a children's book. It's called An Ordinary Day, and it's geared towards little kids, but it teaches families how to have conversations around microaggressions and race, and it gives these visuals for how to start that conversation. And when we were releasing the book, we beta tested it across age ranges, and adolescents really responded to it too, and were like, wow, I didn't think of it that way, or it's interesting to see like things I've experienced in this children's book. And there's questions on the back of the book for ways that you can engage with kids, and then example responses for different definitions. Like if a child is old enough and curious about what a microaggression is, how would you explain that to a little kid? And so we kind of give you a little definition of how to do that. So that might be an interesting conversation with them as well.
I just added it to my cart.
Awesome.
Um,
You can
also,
let me know how they respond.
I also put in the chat, because you mentioned trauma, I put in the chat, Foreign Families Forward has a lot of free courses. And one of them is Trauma 101. One of them is like conflict resolution. So a lot of great things for parents and teachers. And so if any of y'all want to take advantage of those, certainly do. They're free. You don't have to be a foreign family. You don't have to be a resident of Virginia. So if you don't benefit from them, that's great. But also maybe if you want to share, we had a grant that covered this. And so we definitely want to get people to take advantage of it.
When I send out the follow-up information to the rest of the group that couldn't be with us, I'm going to put Dr. Ferguson's link on there also. So they'll have that. And then I will also put that information to, and this topic comes up a lot, especially given that my husband is from Pakistan. So my kid's growing up here, and he's like, it's so easy because when I was growing up, you just do this, this, this. And we're like, this isn't Pakistan. Things are so different now. And he's like, no, it's just easy. We're like, so it goes both ways. We have these conversations with our kids, but we also have these conversations with my husband. So
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And Nicole, you and I may have spoken about this in the past too, but I always talk about these discussions, they often get framed as certain communities need to have this, but I think everybody needs to talk about it. Everybody needs
absolutely.
to be having conversations about culture and being responsive, even folks from minoritized backgrounds. I mean, I've learned and delved into this as a South Asian woman in the last 5 to 6 years of my career. And my husband is Black, so I thought, and I grew up in Northern Virginia, I thought I understood diversity and culture. I've lived in India. I should know what that means, right? Absolutely not. Like, I've done so much learning in the last few years, and I have to have these conversations and be really intentional about it to learn about experiences of other people, because there's a lot I don't know, right? So I think everybody should be having those discussions, not just white communities, which is often how this is framed.
When my son was really young, like just starting kindergarten, we had to have the conversation about Christmas because we don't do Christmas. And my husband's like, that's because there's no Santa Claus and there's no that. I'm like, he can't be that kid who walks in and goes, there's no Santa Claus in kindergarten. And he's
Yeah.
like, but there is. I'm like, we know this, but we have to teach him that he can't ruin other people's traditions and culture if that's what they're doing. So we've had lots of conversations about, but my son's also very not afraid to be like, it's Ramadan and I'm not eating for a month. Hard stop, won't let anyone know the rest of the story. So now people think I starve my kids. So it's fun.
Or he's just very firm in his identity. So you do a good
Absolutely.
job of building up that confidence. He doesn't feel like he needs to.
So if there's no other questions, again, thank you, Dr. Ferguson, for joining me again and helping us really spread the word about being able to have these really hard conversations and knowing that, especially a lot of us going into families, how to help them have these conversations too.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And with that, everyone have a great rest of your day, and I will send a follow-up with all the information for everyone to see.
Bye, everyone.